Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Our featured guests today are Dale Jacobs and Heidi LM Jacobs. Dale Jacobs is the author of Graphic Encounters, Comics, and the Sponsorship of Multimodal Literacy. He's the editor of Sunday with the Tigers, 11 Ways to Watch a Game, and The Miles Horton Reader, and co-editor of A Way to Move, Rhetorics of Emotion and Composition Studies. His academic creative nonfiction book, The 1976 Project on Comics and Grief, is forthcoming. He is the editor of the Windsor Review and teaches in the English department at the University of Windsor. Heidi LM Jacobs' novel, Molly of the Mall, Literary Lass and Purveyor of Fine Footwear, won the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humour in 2020. She is a librarian at the University of Windsor and one of the researchers behind the award-winning Breaking the Color Barrier, Wilfred Boomer Harding, and the Chatham Coloured All-Stars project. She is currently writing a book about the 1934 Chatham Coloured All-Stars, the first Black team to win the Ontario Baseball Amateur Association Championship. Their new book together is 100 Miles of Baseball, 50 Games, One Summer. The book was inspired by their realization in 2016 that something was missing in their relationship with baseball. So they drew a 100-mile radius around their home and set a goal of seeing 50 games within that circle. That took them across southwestern Ontario and into Michigan and Ohio to games at the high school, university, and major league levels. 100 Miles of Baseball is the story of their sports-driven road trip and their rediscovery of their love of the game. Welcome, Dale and Heidi.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, thanks.
Let's start out with a question to both of you. What is it about baseball as a sport that is so attractive? What does it have that doesn't exist in, say, hockey or basketball?
I mean, I guess baseball has that element of time that's different. There's no clock in baseball. It's once you get 27 outs and are ahead, or a game can theoretically go on forever. It's different than the other sports, and there's time in it for talk, but also it's a sport that really rewards close attention to what's happening. Not that other sports don't, but just watching the way a shortstop is tending towards his right or left makes a difference in baseball. So I think that's it for me. And it's also a game of really constant adjustments. You play every day. You're not going to get it right. I mean, the best players get 3 hits out of 10, the very best players. So it's a game that I think teaches you a lot about how to live your life. That's a kind of a big philosophical thing to try to say about the game, but for me, it's all those things.
I think for me, I will pick up on Dale's point about time. Time is different in hockey. You don't get a lot of time to think in hockey games. There's constant movement, or basketball or other sports. I love that baseball's got this built-in time for reflection. And in some ways, to me, it's almost like reading a novel and being a reader, because you're watching events and you're watching how they shape up and different things could happen. And so when someone comes up to bat, you're constantly thinking, okay, what are the different things that could happen here? And of course, chance is always a part of it, but there's always sort of a narrative that you're trying to figure out, like, what are they trying to do here? What's going to happen? And the ending depends on multiple factors. And I think I like it for the same reason I also like fiction. You just never quite know. And it rewards close reading and thinking about all the details. And the more you learn how to see, as is the same with reading fiction, the more you see in the game. So to me, it's a very literary sport. And it's not surprising to me that there's so much baseball literature out there. It's probably one of the most literary sports out there. There seems to be a lot of things written reflectively about it. That's appealing to me as a writer.
Dale, this project helped bring you both back to
baseball in a different way. How did you feel when you realized that you started to realize that your connection to baseball was fading? And how did that impact other areas of your life?
Well, I guess having baseball feel like it was fading made it feel to me like my connection to my father, who passed away in 2008, was starting to fade, and that bothered me. It had always been a pretty big part of my life. It kind of came and went a few times, but that was the biggest part of it. So I wanted to try to recapture that. And since we moved to Windsor in 2000, most of our attention had been on major league games. And as a kid, I went to a lot of amateur games and different kinds of baseball. And I wanted to get back to that experience of sitting behind the catcher and being able to watch closely instead of being way out in the outfield where you can get tickets at a major league game. But I think, in reference to your question, the biggest thing is the connection to my dad.
Dale, in the beginning of the book, both your writing and Heidi's observations of you seemed to project a sense of certainty. Was that how it felt, like you were home again in this project?
I think I felt that way most of the way through. I had a very different experience, as you know from reading the book, than Heidi did. For me, it was really about coming back to the game in the sense that I was rediscovering how to watch. You know, I always paid close attention when I was at Tigers games, but now I was watching every pitch. I was charting pitches. I was really paying close attention to what was happening and to the minute adjustments that were going on. It was a summer that I watched with no rooting interest, and that changed the way I watched the game fundamentally. I didn't care who won any of these games, including the Tigers games we went to. I didn't care. So I was watching baseball for its own sake, and watching it to see how the players were learning, how they're making adjustments. When we were watching high school, how the coaches were teaching them not only about the game, but about how to live. And so for me, it was a process of redeveloping the skills of looking when it came to baseball. But I guess I was always pretty confident about how much I was invested in this project. And I think there's a difference between us in that. And Heidi will speak to that. So I was always invested in the project from day one. And there were very few times where I wasn't immediately immersed in what we were doing. But it was a change over the course of the summer in the way I watched. I think that's the biggest thing that happened.
Well, you've talked a little bit about how baseball is about time and also about changing the way you watched. Do you think that contributed a little bit? You write very poetically about the sport in this. Is that change part of what impacted your writing style here?
Yeah, probably to some degree. I think that's also the influence of reading so much baseball fiction and nonfiction. I have a lot, and I teach baseball literature and culture at the university. And, you know, I've kind of immersed myself in writing about baseball for a long time. And that kind of, I always describe the mode I write in as a kind of elegiac mode about baseball. And that's how when I watch the game and then it filters out into writing about it, that's kind of the natural mode of me thinking about it. So I think it's partially tied to that way of being in the moment, of being present. It's partially tied to the tradition of writing about baseball that is so often in that mode. I think about people like Roger Angell and Joe Posnanski and some of the really great baseball writers. And I also think it's tied to the way I think about my father. So that's inflected there too. He never said very much, but it was always words that mattered when he spoke. So I think all of those things sort of come together in the way that I approach writing about baseball. Because it is, you know, my style is slightly different when I approach baseball than it is when I write about other things. Although, you know, it's also a mode of writing in creative nonfiction that feels natural. to me.
Dale, at the very end, you reflect on how baseball is about connecting, as well as connecting with your dad. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of connections it represents, and what does that mean in this post-pandemic world, or this during pandemic world?
Well, I mean, it's certainly been a way over the years to connect with friends. And I talk about our friend Dave Burke, who's from around here, played ball in Woodsley, and we would go to games with him at Comerica and see the Tigers. When we lived in North Carolina, I would go to baseball games with my friend Rick and watch the university team. In grad school in Nebraska, my friend Kurt and I would go and watch what at the time were terrible Nebraska baseball teams. But we just were there at the park because it was something we both loved. And it's also been a way, the Tigers have been a way to connect with lots of people here. They're a point of commonality, and baseball itself is a point of commonality. I mean, as an academic, in most of my work now is in comic studies. A lot of the people with whom I have a close connection are because they not only like comics, but they also like baseball. That there's that overlap. So I think it is a point of community in lots of ways. There was a no-hitter last night for the Padres, the first in franchise history, and a bunch of us have started talking about it because it's this interesting thing that happens in baseball that we can kind of connect over or talk about. So yeah, I think besides my dad, there's all of that. And then of course the connection with Heidi. We've gone to a lot of baseball together over the years, and it's something that she was an enormous baseball fan when we met, but she came to baseball and I came to ballet, so we'll do things like do a trip to Chicago and we'll go see the Cubs in the afternoon and go see the Joffrey at night. So I think baseball has been a mediator of a lot of my relationships over the years, for sure.
Heidi, you say that you didn't become a real fan until you moved to Windsor and started going to Tigers games. What in the early days did you love about those games?
Oh, there's so much to love. When we first started coming, Comerica was brand new. I think it had opened, was it the summer we got there? I can't remember this. So, our relationship with Detroit is pretty much connected with the Tigers. And so we would go over often, and that's sort of how we got to know Detroit and love it. And so my team interests and my city love are intertwined very, very closely. And then just the magical spectacle of being at a Major League Baseball game. I remember calling my grandfather, who was a huge fan, and like Dale's dad was a prairie farmer who listened to baseball on the radio, and he played in prairie leagues, and calling him like, I'm at a Tigers game. And it was really a great way to sort of connect with my grandfather as well. But just sitting in that park and looking at the Detroit skyline and just watching baseball. And at that time, there was hardly anybody in the stands. So we just had seemed like we had the whole section to ourselves, which is really kind of nice in some ways. It's nice to see people in the stands, but it's also nice to have that sort of space and reflectiveness around us. And then I think too, and Dale alluded to this before, as an academic, you strike out a lot and you step up to the plate a lot, and you just wonder often, why am I doing this? And I found it really, really great. As Dale said, a successful hitter will hit 3 out of 10, which I find so amazing that the success rate is like, wow, 3 out of 10. Phrased another way, the failure rate is, 70%. So I find that a really great metaphor. And I think it really helped me professionally as a writer and academic to just remember to step up to the plate and swing. And, the only thing that really matters is if you hit the ball really right. And you're not going to do it if you don't swing. Tons of cliches there, but I think it really got me through a lot professionally, just thinking about it in that way. I see everybody nodding.
Heidi, you also write about that sense of anxiety that Dale mentioned about the project. And at one of the early games, your pink puffy coat gets soaked and becomes almost a metaphor for your spirits. So what kept you going?
Well, I don't like to quit anything really. So, and I had committed to this project, but I have to say, there was a time when I thought, what have I just done? And it seemed like it happened pretty quickly. We had the idea in February sometime. And, within a month there, I was getting soaked watching baseball and realizing I have 48 more games to go to. And you know what it's like in Windsor in the end of March, you think spring is never, ever going to come. So thankfully the next game we went to the next day was warm and sunny. So I think part of it was just sort of settling in. And I also felt a lot of insecurity about what am I going to do? What am I going to write about? How is this going to go? I felt like I don't know. I really hadn't thought about what I was going to do. And that was a little bit frustrating and anxiety causing for me. But I think very quickly I realized I almost had to approach it as a bit of use this word cautiously, but sort of like an ethnography, just sort of being an observer, sitting in the stands and just watching and letting some of the big decisions about, every time I'd get stressed, like, oh, how am I going to write about this? I'm like, actually, that's not my task right now. My task is just to observe and just see what happens. And so I just, took notes and notes and notes and then thought, oh, I'll figure out what to do with it later. So yeah, some of my anxiety was a little bit about like, I don't know how I'm going to shape this, but, and also, I think that's also connecting with the whole project about like, well, how do I watch baseball? What do I do? How do I rekindle things? And it was a bit of a reboot. So starting from the beginning and working my way through, I think was useful in that way.
Towards the end of the book, you start to see, Heidi, more plays on your own, and you start to feel differently about the game. What has stayed with you about this immersive baseball summer?
Well, I think one of the things, and I don't think Dale was aware of this until we started writing about it, actually, that I spent most of the summer trying to watch baseball more like Dale. Like I felt like I was a inadequate watcher of baseball because I kept noticing birds in the outfield or dogs, or I got all wrapped up in conversations around me. And, I would just miss stuff constantly because there was just so many things to watch at a baseball game. And so I kept thinking, be like Dale, be like Dale. And then toward the end, I realized, you know what, I can only watch baseball like I watch baseball, and maybe that's okay. And I think that might, and then slowly I realized, and it sounds so obvious, that everybody watches it differently and everybody watches it with their own perspective, whether you're watching because it's your grandson or some person you have a crush on, or your son who you hope will get a college scholarship, or the team that your grandfather or parents cheered for forever. Everybody approaches it differently. And I think that was a huge realization to me. And as I stated, it seems so obvious now, but it did sort of make me get out of my comfort zone of watching baseball and try to watch it through other people's eyes and other people's positions. So I think by the end of the book, I realized, you know what, I'm just going to lean into seeing the dogs and the funny little children and overhearing those strange stories about uses of peppermint in your kitchen and what have you, because that's all part of the experience, right? It's not necessarily just the stuff on the field, it's the whole package of watching baseball.
So Heidi, throughout the book, you imagine historical scenes of the Chatham All-Stars, and at the end, you find a connection right near your home. How do you think writing this book might influence your work on the historical book?
Well, that's really, I was doing both projects at the same time. That summer, I was incredibly fragmented with, Dale and I were also both working full time as we were doing this. And I think there were lots of competing interests for our attention. So I blame some of my lack of attention on just trying to keep everything straight. But I was working on the All-Stars at the same time and researching them and going through the material and the scrapbooks. And there were a number of points where I just I remember watching, teams with one Black player and thinking, wow, that's sort of like Boomer Harding on his hockey team, or driving around to these small parks and sort of visualizing what it would have been like for them to play. And it really helped. I think both of the projects really informed each other at that time. It also helped me as I was going through the box scores from 1934 to be able to try and figure out, okay, this is what happened here, and this is what they're trying to do, and this is why this player is so unusual, like King Terrell, why he's so awesome. And and just I think it really helped inform. I would have a hard time separating the two processes right now, but they were never far from my mind. And even going to the corner of Michigan and Trumbull, and where the new baseball park is, and I'd purchased that little brick to put in the corner of Michigan and Trumbull, and to see their names there was just really exciting, because we all wanted them to have been able to play there, but now they're there. And so that was really lovely. But yeah, I think it really helped me think about the team and the players, and just watching baseball in the way that they would have played probably in the smaller parks with the local crowd, being able to visualize what it would have been like for them to play at Sterling Park. And then, as you write at the end, I realized, reading, because again, I was working on both projects, finding this little essay or this box score or ad or whatever, that they were playing, just, I could almost throw a baseball from my room to the park right now, which just blew me away. So somehow it's really quite a magical thing.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions for both of you about the writing process. Dale and Heidi, when you set out to write the book, what kind of book did you imagine it would be, and what models were in your mind, and how close did the finished book come to that original vision?
That's a good question.
I don't know. In some ways, it was an easy model, because right off the bat, we knew that it would be a two-voiced thing, and it would follow chronological order, and there would be chapters. So the form of it was basically articulated right at the get-go. So the confines of the project, 100 miles, 50 games, one summer, two voices, all of that was sort of built in. I think the unknown for me, for sure, is because I felt like it really needed an arc, that it couldn't just be, here are my observations, because then I should have just typed up my notes, which were just illegible, and you owe your reader some work to make sense of it all. And so that was actually the hard part for me, to figure out what did I learn this summer, and how did that evolve. And I think quite happily for us both, the two perspectives worked really well together. We were very separate in our note taking, and very separate in our writing, because we knew we'd have to merge them together, and we probably didn't get them together until we'd each written up each game, and then we put them together and then saw what we saw. And it was really interesting to see how the two perspectives fed into each other.
Yeah, I think Heidi's right that structure was there kind of in the back of our heads. Even as we were taking notes on all these games, we pretty much knew we wanted chronological order, and we knew we wanted to write about every game. But earlier than that, in the planning process, I know for me, there were a couple books in the back of my mind. One was a book by Daniel Okrent called 9 Innings, which is 300-page book about one baseball game, where he uses one game to go out on these digressions on baseball history, on how baseball is played, etc. And I have always thought about this book as the inverse of that it's, instead of one game, it's 50 games and two voices. And the other book was Sunday with the Tigers, that I had edited, that was a lot of different perspectives on one game. So those were all kind of rattling around in my head as we wrote this. But in terms of how, I didn't really know how it would turn out. We had the structure there. Like Heidi, I knew I needed an arc, and that actually developed as I read my notes. Like Heidi, I came to watch baseball differently, and a lot of my part of the book, I think, is showing how that happened for me. By the end, I think I was watching a bit more like Heidi watches. I was noticing things in the stands, etc. But yeah, the structure, I think we were lucky, because for me, on any piece of writing, whether it's a book or a 20-page essay, the structure is always the key component. The structure dictates, for me at least, the structure dictates so much of what I do. And when we had this structure from the beginning, the idea of two voices and 50 games chronological, that really helped to guide what I was doing and then what we were doing when we came to put it all together.
The part of your process is the structure, or your structure is the process, and you each wrote sections of the book separately, and then you edited them together. How did you approach that, and what were you looking for as you were editing?
We sat out on our back deck. We each had our half of the manuscript printed out on just on regular single-sided paper, and we had a laptop, and we always, I think both of us used the term, we shuffled it together. And we did an initial pass through so that within each game, we went back and forth between the voices at what seemed like natural places. And we did that actually, and my memory of it is we did that in an afternoon. We shuffled it all together. Then we read the whole thing through, and we made a few, but not a lot of adjustments, but mostly for chronology, where we hadn't got the chronology quite correct. And then at that point, I think we had 144,000 words at that point. And now the manuscript is about 118,000. So the editing process, a lot of it was cutting, a lot of it was tightening. We had a couple great early readers, and we had a great editor at Biblioasis in Sharon Hanna. And Dave Burke, who I mentioned before, was one of our readers. So that helped. And Holly also was a great reader for us. So Holly Went, sorry. And just getting that feedback, I think, was so valuable for us. But initially we really did just shuffle it together and then work from there.
So this question as well is for Heidi and Dale. What was the most challenging part of creating this book, and what was the most rewarding?
I think getting that, once we shuffled it together, we could see that it was working, but it wasn't quite there. And I think because we both had arcs that we wanted to tease out. I don't want to say impose, because I think it came from that, but we definitely both needed to shape. And we had to shape them at a similar pace and a similar moment. And they both had to be true to ourselves. And I think that was really difficult, just to try to get that balance just right. So that, I think that was difficult, but we both, firmly believe that the magic of writing happens in the editing. And that is actually an incredibly creative point. So we just did tons and tons of tweaking, and Sharon was invaluable in that way. And our readers were really great in terms of, they kept saying, Heidi, stop beating yourself up for watching baseball badly. Like, that was my big thing. Or stop beating yourself up for not paying attention, like those kinds of things. Like, okay, and just sort of paring it down. And we really did get rid of lots and lots and lots of pages. So we weren't afraid to cut stuff. So I think getting those arcs working in a complementary way was difficult, but I think it was, I'll let Dale talk about what was difficult and satisfying for him. But first, like, satisfying for that was when we had people say these two voices work really well together. And actually, I think the moment where the Globe and Mail did a really nice piece on it, and they said, and I can't believe we didn't come up with this description for us. It's like Dale's the play-by-play and Heidi's the color commentator. We saw that, we're like, oh yeah, if we had known that, actually, if we figured that out way back, I think that would have helped. I have no idea how the most, obvious sports narration example did not occur to us, but it didn't. But I think, but maybe that's good too. But yeah, just figuring out what each of us were contributing, I think was difficult, but worth it. And
yeah, I guess I would say something pretty similar. The actual drafting of the book went quite smoothly. I mean, honestly, I would we have an office in Walkerville, and I would go to the office every morning, and I would sit down to write one game, and I would write one game a day. And so the challenge there was to figure out how am I going to approach this game, because it would have been easy to fall into a pattern where I just have the same approach every game. So that was, while the drafting, I said it was easy, that's not completely true. That was the challenge, was what's the angle on each of these games. So that's the challenge through the drafting. And then, as Heidi said, it is as easy it was at the beginning to just shuffle it together, then it was challenging to get them to speak to each other in a way that developed both those arcs, but also played off one another at the same time, because those both had to happen. And so I agree with Heidi that having readers say the voices work in concert with each other, that's very gratifying for the book as a whole. And then for me, I think the most gratifying comment is when people have said that I take the high school games or university games or minor league games as seriously as I do the major league games. Because that was one of the aims I had from the beginning, was that all of this is baseball and all of it deserves to be taken seriously.
If you could do all of this all over again, would you?
Would we do another 100 miles and another 50 games?
Or would you do it first?
I don't think we could repeat it. I mean, that's one of the things we talked about. It was such a special summer that it wouldn't be the same. Would I like to have a summer of just going to baseball games again? Sure, but it wouldn't be what this was. I think it was unique and something that we just couldn't repeat in that kind of a way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would do, someone said, oh, are you going to do 100 games and 200 miles? Like, no, not at all. Like, I don't think, there's other stuff I'd like to do with my life. And that was such a special summer that I think it would just always pale in comparison. And I'm not sure we would learn twice as much by going to twice as many. Like, I feel like we've learned what we probably would learn. I mean, we can obviously learn more, but 50 was a nice number. At one point I talk in the book about, I think I said something like, I think I'm at the point of data saturation in some ways. I'm not sure I can learn much more, but I'm glad we still had more games after that. But
and just on, sorry.
Go ahead,
I was
yeah.
just going to say, picking up on that point about data saturation, I think we did get to that point where we'd kind of moved in the direction we were both going to in terms of watching baseball. But that point in August where, we saw so many games in a week and it was just constant baseball. I also think that was, at least for me, important to go through that, because that's what a baseball season is. I mean, we saw 50 games in a summer, but a major league player plays 162 games. And even a minor league player plays like 120 games. Even a college player plays, they play 50 games. So part of baseball is this idea that it's day in, day out. It's different than every other sport. It's not football where you play once a week. It's not hockey where you play every couple days. It's every day. So it's twice as many games as hockey or as basketball. And that's one of the other, to go back to your first question, that's one of the other things that makes baseball different than other sports is we do this every day. That's what baseball players say. This is, it's part of your life. You don't turn it off. And so I think as writers, at least for me, I needed to go through that and to really finally understand this is what the dog days of summer actually really mean, beyond it being just an expression. So
actually, when you were talking, Dale, I was reminded of, I describe a scout behind me at one point saying, okay, I've seen what I need to see here, I'm gone. But we would watch the whole game. And that's the other thing too. I was talking to someone and her kids play baseball. She goes, oh, well, 50 games is nothing. I go to 100 games every summer. Like, what you guys are doing is not much. But I also, I saw this person at a couple of games and we watched the whole, like we did watch every inning. And I will admit my attention did go off, but it was that concentrated watching the game, pen in hand most of the time. And that sort of discipline, we could have ended like, okay, I think I've seen enough here, but I think something happened when we pushed through. I think we might have had another 10 games or 12 games or something at that point. And it's just like, okay, there's more to learn, and just sort of pushing through that. And I think we both did feel a little bit like the ball players just, showing up at the park every day, and it became a job. It was. And I think we treated it like work, and it was fun, but it was also, it was work.
Well, it sounds like baseball is a practice kind of like writing. You didn't mention that it was literary. Do you think that there's a connection there, Heidi?
I'm sorry, you cut out there for a minute.
I'm sorry. It sounds like if you see baseball as a practice, kind of like writing is. Is there a connection there with that literary nature, you think? Or?
Oh, absolutely. And I think in the book, I talk about why I love Curtis Granderson so much. And partially it's because he and I were both having a summer where it was sort of like make it or break it. And I just kept looking at him stepping up to the plate with that sort of intensity. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to make it as a writer and academic, I also just need to coming up. And I do. And it's also, the thing about baseball is showing up, right? It's, the muse doesn't show up unless you show up, right? And so, and it's just putting in the batting practice or the writing practice or just doing that. And I think one of the things that really struck me is how much of, like, I was really intrigued to watch a lot of the college players in games that they weren't playing, either that they weren't, in the starting lineup or they weren't on yet in tournaments. Just watching them study the game was so fascinating to me, because I just sort of realized that they are also students of the game too. And they always are. And they're always observing and watching. And they're never complacent in their knowledge base. They're always trying to learn too. And I think that's, very similar to writing, that you always need to be watching and thinking and observing and putting in the time and putting in your batting practice or whatever, and paying attention to what's going on in the field, whether it's on your page or a baseball field or in the literary world. So I think there's lots of parallels with that for sure.
Would you each like to read a little bit from the book for us?
I'll go first. Thursday, May 17th, 2018. College of Worcester Fighting Scots versus Wabash College Little Giants. Nicolay Field, Adrian, Michigan. Game time temperature 79 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm just going to read the very last part from this particular game. By the time I resumed standing behind home plate at the top of the ninth, the score is 4-2. Wabash scoring on a single sequence in the sixth. Dittman is still on the mound, and I'm back to take some photographs and video to supplement my notes. He opens with a strikeout, but the ball gets away from the catcher, caroming a bit towards the Wabash dugout. First baseman yells, "Outside, outside," as the catcher retrieves the ball, indicating which side of the bag to throw the ball. As I pull out my iPhone, crouch behind the plate, and position the lens in the center of one of the fence's diamonds, I hear a voice say, "Is he yours?" I turn to see an older man in the front row, directly behind me, one leg folded over the other, fingers interlocked around his left knee. He's wearing a blue windbreaker, his white hair peeking out from beneath his baseball cap. "Pardon me? That pitcher, is he your boy?" I blink, try to process what this man is saying and why he thinks that the Worcester pitcher might be my son. Taking photos, but not with a professional camera, so I must not be covering the games as a photographer. No radar gun or pitch chart, so I must not be a scout. I quickly realized that the next best guess would have to be that I'm family, and as I begrudgingly admit to myself, I am about the right age to be Dittman's father. Ground out to third for the second out. No, he's not mine. I don't have anyone playing this weekend. We're just here to see some baseball. He nods, doesn't say anything else. I can tell he's surprised by my answer, but also happy that baseball alone is enough to draw someone to the park on a beautiful spring day in Adrian, Michigan. At least that's what I imagine as I walk back to my seat, and the final out of complete game win for Chandler Dittman. Final score 4-2 Worcester.
Right. I'm going to read it's toward the end of section Sunday, June 3rd, Detroit Tigers versus the Toronto Blue Jays. Comerica Park, Detroit, game time temperature 64 degrees. What I'm going to read is toward the end of it, into this section, and a couple things that are important to know. I'm trying to situate it within my affection for Detroit and my past of going to games in the Tigers. And it's not a huge, and we're sitting way up in the 300 section, so we can sort of see outside of Detroit. There isn't a lot of chatter up here, but a few seats down in the row behind us, there are a dad and his daughter. The dad looks like the owner of an indie record store, not at all like the typical baseball fan you might imagine. The daughter, about 6 years old, is wearing hipster jeans and a cool jean jacket with a flowery shirt. She is quietly snuggled up to her dad, wrapped by the game unfolding beneath us. He's explaining the game to her and has just broken down a suicide squeeze. He details why the Tigers attempted it and why, in this case, it failed. She nods. He points out that a fly ball could score a run here, and they sit in silence a while. He tells her why he thinks the Tigers need to stop swinging for the fences and just worry about getting on base. She asks questions I cannot hear, but I notice he listens carefully. He talks to her gently, like an equal, but still respectful of her childlike wonder at the world. I see him outlining not only how the game is played, but how to watch a game of baseball. Captivated by this dad and his little girl, I cast my mind toward her future when she tries to explain to people, perhaps even to herself, what baseball means to her. And I know at different points in her life, she will try to describe Sundays like these with her dad and with the Tigers, and whomever she talks to will never really understand, though they might pretend to. I'll skip Dale's section. I know there's 1,000,000 to 1 chance that this dad or his little girl will ever read this book, and a 2,000,000 to 1 chance that they'll know that I'm writing about them. But if they do, I hope they know that seeing them together and listening to their conversations has started to clarify so much of what I thought about baseball means to me. I still can't articulate what it is they've shown me, but I know it's about love and it's about hope and how baseball can bring those two things together. It's 8-1 for Toronto and the sun has just come out from behind the clouds. I watch Curtis in the outfield. I stare at the Detroit skyline. I turn my Tigers cap inside out. Dale looks over and says, I think that's the most hopeful rally cap I've ever seen. It's baseball, I say. Anything can happen. Final score, 8-4 Blue Jays.
Thank you so much for sharing your book with us. It was wonderful.
Thank
you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.